Welcome to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center's Teachers Workshop Series on Genocide. My name is Sam Parrish, and it's my pleasure to host this session. This is session 4, and it is on Yugoslavia from 1941 to 1980. This is part of a year-plus long ongoing Teachers Workshop Series focused on genocide and mass human rights violations. As always, I would like to thank the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, known as the Florida Task Force, and the Merrill Color Educator Series. Both organizations have been very important for, very supportive for Teachers Workshop Series around Florida for people to educate educators so then that information can be cascaded down to students. So a tremendous amount of support from both of those organizations, indeed. So to review, session 4, as all of them, is a standalone session. So if your particular area of interest is Yugoslavia, you're more than welcome to attend just this series, this part of the series. Having attended sessions 1, 2, and 3 is not required. In session 1, but just to review, so we're on the same page. In session 1, we covered some basic definitions. We defined genocide, and the other 3 that I mentioned that we're calling mass human rights violations. Those include crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. All those definitions we took directly from the United Nations website, so we're all working with the same definition. We also put together the structure for a tracker that we're going to use. The tracker identifies different time frames within an event. So we'll see that with Yugoslavia. We'll see the who, the what, which political party was involved, time frame, of course, and we relate it to how we might see it today. So we'll put it on a today's left-right paradigm. We also, of course, look at numbers of people killed, always keeping in mind that while we're dealing with data, that each data point represents a human being, and so we never want to forget that. We also added to that tracker a column for each of the 4 definitions of genocide and the 3 mass human rights violations. So we'll track it that way as well. In session 1, we also looked at Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, which kind of set this whole thing up, so we can identify stages along the way. In session 2, we covered a specific genocide, and that was Cambodia. And in session 3, we covered what wasn't a genocide, had elements definitely of genocide, but was definitely had crimes against humanity, war crimes, and what could be construed as ethnic cleansing, and that was on Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. Interestingly, in both of the previous 2 sessions, we identified the styles of governance or the philosophy of governance and we identified that we have representatives from what we stereotypically think of in today's terminology or today's mindset as left and right, so both sides of the pole. We also identified a horrible creativity that was used in Cambodia and was used in Mexico in the Mexican Revolution, and how it was applied to the treatment of human beings. It's a staggering display of macabre ways to hurt, torment, torture, and kill other people. Hopefully we'll see an end to that, but I fear that's not going to be the case. We also noticed that religious intolerance was prevalent in Cambodia and the Mexico and the Mexican Revolution series, along with what we're looking at as a general lack of respect for human life. Both of those were apparent, both were prevalent, and both seemed like they were indicative that a genocide or some sort of mass human rights violation could potentially happen. So we're going to try and track that idea too, and see if that forms a trend, that a general lack of respect for religious life, but more than that, even a lack of respect for human life, is an indicator that something like that could potentially happen. And it's certainly, we identified it in Cambodia and Mexico, the Mexican Revolution. We will see here in Yugoslavia a repeat of the horrible treatment of other people / the enemy. We'll also see that broad religious differences play a role, but more of a historic role, although there are definitely elements of immediate religious animosity that we'll see between the three major religions that make up this time frame in Yugoslavia. So is the latter an indicator that genocide or an other mass human rights violation is imminent? I don't think that the religious tolerance that we'll see in Yugoslavia is in this case. It was in Cambodia and was in Mexico. I don't see it as being a prevalent guarantor or indicator of, but we'll see as we go along, for sure. Today we're going to go back to World War II, that time frame, and focus specifically on Yugoslavia. But I have a handful of caveats. The geographic area itself doesn't lend to a tidy study. And for it to be applicable for students especially, I'm going to provide a really kind of a high level, really broad, pretty substantial overview of the players, the main characters, some significant actions that were taken, also a timeline of events specifically for the Germans, who were one of four anyway of the groups of players. But then I want to switch, so this overwhelming amount of information and this kind of this foreign element is something that we can apply for students. So I mentioned foreign. There is a bewildering array of names that are foreign, that would be foreign to most Americans. By the way, I will do my best on these, but apologies for any mispronunciation I make. So I mentioned the geographic area. The geographic area to which we refer is known as the Balkans. The word is derived from a Turkish word, and it means mountain. For our purposes, I would say Americans or North Americans for sure, when we think Balkans, we're talking about a peninsula that is kind of in southeastern Europe, between the Black Sea and the Adriatic Seas, and with the Mediterranean at the south. So think of just east of Italy. And I've got a few maps that we'll check out for this to make sense for all of us, actually, not just students. This region gives us a vague recognition, or rings a bell in the back of our minds, and maybe for students as well. But again, it seems like it's someplace that's out there, over there. It's not something we can really wrap our hands on. So hopefully we'll be able to do that through the maps in this session. Now, in my interpretation of this, because of the complexity, I mean, it was bewildering for me. Because of the complexity of this, I think that activities are kind of difficult in a way, but may be a better way to approach studying this topic than looking at this as a straight history. You're going to see the names and the countries and the organizations that grow up. It just is I've used this word before, but a mishmash, a muddled gathering. And to add to that, the foreign sounding names. You'll see, I think, why I suggest that activities might be the better way to do it. Luckily, in the session 4 folder where you access the link for this YouTube video, you will have hopefully seen a list of activities. So they're in there. And that is my attempt to kind of simplify this, to clarify it, and to help focus on more specific aspects that are something tangible and something that students can really grab a hold of, rather than the whole study of Yugoslavia. Because again, what is a Yugoslavia to students? All right, so for example, to start, something as simple as a seek and find activity to identify those numerous names of people. We see two people right here on the screen, one of whom is very identifiable, but people, the different places, and other things as well. I mean, there are different organizations as well. So a lot of things we could do. So for example, the word Chetnik, the word Slovene, Ustasi, and Tito. That's very cumbersome, but I think it could be profitable for students to be able to identify those, and I think really required for students to be able to study any further. They need to be able to identify Chetnik, Slovene, Ustasi, and Tito, for example. This could be done individually, but it could also be done in teams. And another thing that may make this easier, and you'll see it in the folder, but is grouping these together. So for example, Chetnik, we'll see, is an irregular volunteer. So that's a group. Slovene, that is a nationality. Ustasi is another group, one of the groups that we'll focus on for sure. And Tito, the man that is on the left of the screen with a pipe, is a very famous Marshal Tito. He'll become a very prominent leader. So we have groups, we have nationalities, and we have people, for example. And the names are maybe vague to us. Maybe we have some sort of recollection or feel for them. Chetnik, sort of. Tito, yes. But I think for students' purposes, if they could identify those in teams or individually, whichever you prefer, but maybe grouping them together, all the nationalities together, all the main leaders together, all the main groups together, so students can get a real handle on this. I think it might help quite a bit. Another activity that could be extremely helpful would be a map activity, something simple as coloring what we'll see are these 9 different regions within what was Yugoslavia, courtesy of the German occupation that we'll see. The result, and Italian, I don't want to leave them out, the German and Italian occupation, and how Yugoslavia then was split up into 9 regions. I think identifying those regions, very helpful to do so on a map. And different variations can be done based on your interests. You could do a map, for example, on where certain nationalities were, where certain religions were more prevalent within those 9 regions, different occupation groups, and so forth. So we'll see some maps that might give you an idea for that. It could be where German concentration camps were. There were German concentration camps set up, but there were also concentration camps set up by the Ustasi, by the Partisans, Tito's Partisans / the communists. So there could be an interesting activity on identifying concentration camps throughout Yugoslavia. And I think it would be shocking to people how many there were. The Germans for sure, but also used by the Ustasi and by the Partisans. It would, I think, a map activity like that, including the concentration camps, could also be interesting because then it will link what took place then in World War II and bring it over to what happened in the 1990s and 2000s. That will actually be the next session. So I think that might be an interesting thing as well. A daring, very relevant activity could be to compare Macedonia's Antifa, which was there, Antifa, with today's, maybe America's Antifa organization. That would be one you would want to tread extremely carefully with, or tread on very carefully. But it could be interesting. Maybe that's more applicable in the next session. So we'll see. But Macedonia and their Antifa for sure. That would require a great deal of research. Maybe it could be an extra credit project. It'd be a difficult one, but it could be I think very enlightening for a student who's interested in that. Again, maybe a better session, a better fit in session 5, because that'll take up with Tito's death, which again, pictured on the left, his death in 1980, and then the resulting events that escalate from Tito's death all the way up into the 2000s. So our pretty recent history. And then during which time Macedonia becomes an issue on its own. So that kind of idea, a sort of a tangential activity based on the Antifa one. On the Antifa idea in Macedonia, for example, could be to compare and contrast the Macedonian Antifa, their actions, maybe with Germany's brown shirts and their actions, and American Antifa and other organizations that appear to be a groundswell root organizations. Maybe the protests in Hong Kong that are occurring today, this being September 2020. So there are other ideas, and I think you can kind of take what I've got for you in the folder and improve upon it a great deal. But maybe that sparks some sort of idea with especially the Antifa idea and the groundswell, the idea of grassroots organizations taking place. Kind of interesting, could be very interesting. Lastly, and I think very relevantly, could be to look specifically at two events. One is called Bloody Christmas, and the other, the Blyberg Massacre. Kind of a compare and contrast research to put together what took place in those events. We'll certainly cover Blyberg, and you'll see why I think, if you're not familiar with it, why it could be very interesting. A separate idea with that Bloody Christmas event could be to look into that event. There is very little information about it online. If you just do a general search, if you put Bloody Christmas, you're going to first of all bring up 3 or 4 different events that are called Bloody Christmas. This will be the one that takes place in Yugoslavia during World War II. Very little information online. What information there is online is overwhelmingly extremely biased. So you can tell which side the writer is writing from. There's no attempt to appear fair or unbiased. So that itself could be an interesting exercise or activity in how to research information, how to assess sources, because the bias really gets really strong. That in itself could be of interest. Maybe comparing both sets of sources, side 1 and side 2 sources that differ dramatically, and if they cover a similar event, to see how they cover it, to get a feel for the tone of the language, and to point out biases from both, could be an interesting activity for a student. And there is a YouTube link. I've got a list of links in the folder as well, and that has information that would help out a great deal with the activities as well. All right, I said earlier that this was doesn't lend to a tidy study. I think I said it was because of the geographic area, but there's so much more that does not make this tidy. Ethnic differences, religious differences, linguistic differences, historic differences, and cultural differences, all gathered together and forced into one nation that became Yugoslavia. It kind of seems almost inevitable in a way that it wouldn't work. And so we'll see the demise of Yugoslavia during World War II and its growth, its rebirth. And then we'll see in session 5 how Tito held it together. Those ethnic, religious, linguistic, historic, and cultural differences kind of rear their collective head later on, again in the 1990s and the 2000s. We'll also get an idea for the footing of session 5's look at what is called, session 5 is called Once Yugoslavia. So that'll include Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, and other events, again, names that we know, and those are much more recent history. And plus some other events that occurred in that Balkans region in the late 90s and 2000s, and from which we get the term Balkanization, and that term has actually been applied even in America. So Balkanization has become a term kind of like Quisling from World War II. It's become a term that's able to be applied generally and not specific to that historic period. I mentioned maps. Here's a map that kind of really helps us get a feel for where we're talking about. Within this territory, you have major religions with major religious differences. We have Croatia. And in Croatia, you have a majority Catholic faith. Their rival, their historic rival, Serbia, you have majority Orthodox Christianity faith. Slovenia, you have a Catholic majority faith. Makes sense in a way with Slovenia and Croatia here, and we'll see how they work together. In Montenegro, you have an Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox faith. In Macedonia, you have an Orthodox faith. In Bosnia, it's called Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have Bosnian Muslims. You also have Bosnian Croats who are Catholic. And you also have Bosnian Serbs who are Orthodox. So not surprisingly, Bosnia and Herzegovina are maybe a flashpoint during World War II, and absolutely a flashpoint, as we'll see in session 5 in our more modern history in the 90s and the 2000s. And you have a group, the Chetniks, who we'll see, and they're mostly made up of Orthodox Serbs. So a question I asked myself was, is all of this infighting among the different peoples that make up this one nation of Yugoslavia? Is all this, we'll see crimes against humanity? Yes. War crimes? Yes. Attempted ethnic cleansing? Absolutely. Is it about religion? That's what people say. Oh, this is a religious war. Is it about ethnicity? Is it about nationality? Is it about political philosophy? So I've had people say that this is very simple. It's religious differences. You have Catholics, you have Muslims, you have Orthodox. Piece of cake. But I'm not sure it's that way. As you get deeper into this, you see, again, those historic, cultural, religious, linguistic differences. And I think those play as much a role. So is it religious? In part, yes. Is it ethnic? Yes, I think so. Is it based on nationality? Yeah, I think so. Is it racial? Yes, it is. The Croats, as we'll see with the Ustasi, considered themselves a more superior race. Is it political philosophy? I think there's elements of that as well. All right, so let's backtrack here. We've kind of got that bit of background. Now let's look actually at Yugoslavia and start with very basic. Yugoslavia. What does that even mean? Some of you may remember the car that was called the Yugo. It's kind of interesting. And Yugo, the word Yugo means south. I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that the word slave comes from the Slavs. And so this ends up being Yugoslavia is the land of the South Slavs. Okay, so this is what Yugoslavia looked like. I hope that I'm out of the way here. This is what Yugoslavia looked like in 1933. So this is when Hitler's taken power, but this is well before the invasion. But this gives us an idea of what the country looked like. You can see its southern border all the way down with Greece, and its northern border up to Austria and to Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. And then if we look at the previous map, we can see what it's comprised of. And again, adding that to those other differences that we talked about, you can see how that could be problematic. So background, there were a couple of wars called the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. Of course, World War I then followed. And then there was a conflict between the Greeks and the Turks, historic as well, that it took place in 1923. And those series of wars and conflicts resolved, in theory, the border of Yugoslavia. So that series of conflicts resolved the border issues, in theory. However, that wasn't entirely true, because the Hungarians had issues with it, for sure. They weren't satisfied. The Italians weren't satisfied over in this area, the northwest part, this border, and also this coastline here, the Dalmatian coastline. The Macedonians, not satisfied to say the least, right? The Bulgarians were not satisfied. Yugoslavs themselves were not satisfied. The Greeks were not satisfied. And there were even within this new Yugoslavia, there were colonies of ethnic Germans and ethnic Austrians who also weren't satisfied with the borders, who weren't satisfied with the borders, who I suspect would have liked that Austria-Slovenia border to have been further south. Yugoslavia came to be in 1918 after World War I, and it's ironic because there was a shared sense of nationalism. Even more ironic is who shared it. It was the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Serbs. And again, we pointed out the differences between the Serbs and the Slovenes and Croats, very dramatic differences between those three nationalities. So dramatic differences between those, among those three nationalities. What united them was this sense of nationalism, bringing Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes together, and they were united against a common foe, and that was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so that unified sense of nationality gave birth to Yugoslavia at the end of World War I in 1918. Within this country of Yugoslavia, there were those three major religions that we discussed. There were three completely different alphabets: Latin, Cyrillic, and an Albanian alphabet that was different as well. There were at least four major different languages, and there were minorities as well within the borders of Yugoslavia. It's often said that certain countries have fighting traditions, and that is certainly the case with the different groups here, that they were fighters. But there were also historic blood feuds. There was also that mountainous terrain. We have the word Balkans, which means mountain in Turkish. So we have this very rough mountainous terrain, which necessarily leads to rough roads and a lack of railway lines. So that prevented easy travel, and that prevented people from coming together from different backgrounds and maybe saying, we can trade with these people. Maybe we can ally with these people. Maybe we can intermarry with these people. Maybe we can share the same country with these people. They are at least at that time, they are our countrymen. What it did lead to was excellent terrain for guerrilla warfare. And we will see tremendous amount of guerrilla warfare while under the occupation of the Germans and the Italians. That sense of nationalism that brought Yugoslavia together in 1918, or that had brought them together and kind of culminated in the birth of Yugoslavia in 1918, started to show weaknesses by 1921. In that 18 to 21 period, they were working on creating a constitution. So there were already differences and major differences because they couldn't agree on the new Yugoslavian constitution. There was a regent there, a monarch, and his name was Prince Paul, and he leaned toward the Western allies. Later on, we're talking, he leaned toward who would be the Western allies, the Brits and the French and the Americans, Canadians, and so forth. But he also needed to curry favor within Europe, since that's where they were located, much closer, and that included Austria, that included Italy, that included Germany. So this still doesn't give us an idea, though. We're looking at this map, and okay, so we know it's going to be broken into 9 regions. It's a significant territory, lots of differences within that. But 1939, so we'll move 6 years forward from this map. 1939, the population was just about 15.5 million people. To give you an idea of how big this is, Yugoslavia is about the same size as the U.S. state of Wyoming. Now, Wyoming's a big state, but still, that gives you an idea. So we said approximately 15.5 million people. And to give you an idea of the differences, Serbs comprised about 6.5 million of those people. Serbs used the Cyrillic alphabet. We said that they were primarily Orthodox in religion. There were Muslims and others as well, but primarily Orthodox. During World War I, they had opposed the Central Powers. Many of the Serbs who joined organizations under the German and Italian occupation during World War II became the group that we know as the Chetniks. That's a group we'll focus on separately. Croats comprised about 3.75 million people. They lived in an area, as we saw on the map, that was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until after World War I. They were more Western oriented. We said that they were primarily Catholic. And though their language was very similar to the Serbian language, so they could understand, they used the Latin alphabet. So they used Latin and the Serbs used the Cyrillic alphabet. So the communication in that respect was very difficult. Plus, the Serbs were strongly anti-German. The Croats had a strong influence from the Germans. Since we're talking that group, another group that's very similar, just to the north of Croatia, the Slovenes. Slovenes a smaller nation, Slovenia a smaller nation, smaller population of about 1.5 million people. They too, like the Croats, were Western oriented. They too, like the Croats, used a Latin alphabet. They were generally Catholic and German influenced. So you can see how the Croats and the Slovenes naturally came together. Hungarians. Again, up here in the border, this territory was disputed, but there were ethnic or national Hungarians, Hungarian nationals living in Yugoslavian territory, about 500,000 of them. There were Albanians, about 500,000 of them. Now, not part of Yugoslavia specifically, but plays a role here for sure. Romanians, about 250,000 of them, as well as Czechs, Slovaks, other Slavic people. Plus, we mentioned the German and Austrian colonies. There were about 500,000 of them as well. Now, it's said that Yugoslavia went on to suffer 1 million deaths. Of that 1 million, 40% were civilian, 40% were soldiers, 60% were civilian. We'll see on the tracker, however, that depending on the sources and the estimates, that the numbers really range from 1 million to 1.6 million. But the number that is accepted or seems to be accepted is 1 million, but we'll see differences on the tracker. That's not unlike with the Cambodian genocide, where we saw ranges of numbers, really substantial differences in those ranges, within those ranges. And of course, with the Mexico and the Mexican Revolution was also difficult because of record keeping and the status of the country and its record keeping system. So let's just focus on civilian deaths, of course, and we'll start with Jews. Jews were killed by Germans during the German occupation. They were also killed by Germany and Italy, the Axis collaborators within Yugoslavia. Would tend to be the Ustasi, who we're talking about from Croatia. And those numbers are absolutely attributable directly to the Holocaust and genocide. Serbs and Roma were killed by Croatians, the Ustasi mainly. Probably half of the Serbian killings were directly attributable to the Holocaust. The Roma killings were absolutely part of the Holocaust. And that in part goes to the intent. We saw intent playing a role in the definitions of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. There's a physical nature and there's the intellectual or the psychological intent of the action that was taking place. And in the case of Serbians, the killing, the intent was along the lines of the genocide that was being perpetrated, but not all of it. So that's why we say half of those killings were attributable to the Holocaust. So if it were Germans and their allies killing the Serbs and the intent was to cleanse an area, that would definitely be the Holocaust. If it were German allies such as the Ustasi, it could very well have been the Ustasi working in league with their German allies, or it could be part of the historic Croatian-Serbian rivalry, in which case it was more of an opportunistic killing and therefore not directly attributable to the Holocaust and genocide, but absolutely fitting within one or more of the categories of the mass human rights violations. All right, so those are some of the people who were killed. Jews by Germans and Yugoslavians, Serbs and Roma killed by the Ustasi, Muslims and Croats were killed by Chetniks. So again, if we look back, we're talking about Muslims and Croats being killed by Serbs. So the Serbs, Chetniks, killing Croats and Muslims, many of the Muslims from Bosnia, called Bosniaks. You had Slovenes, people from Slovenia, at least 5,000 Slovenian civilians killed by the Italian occupiers. You have Croats and others at the end of the war who had collaborated with the Axis, and they were killed by the Partisans. The Partisans are the communists from throughout this area who we'll look into specifically, and they are affiliated with Tito. And they were killed, the Croats and others escaping. We'll see the list of who these others were comprised of. The list, we'll see who comprised that list later, but they were killed by the communist partisans. But they had an assist in a way from the British allies. So we'll see that especially with the Blyberg Massacre, which is a very unusual, I hope, event. And maybe, again, that might be of interest to students. It might be an interesting way to focus the subject on something tangible and maybe more manageable. Bulgarians, people who became known as collaborationists, German soldiers and other enemy soldiers were also killed by the partisans, the Tito's communist partisans. The Hungarian army was responsible for killing 78,000 civilians, and it would be people along this disputed territory right here. So it could have been Croats, it could have been Serbs. I think the killing was indiscriminate. This was more about reclaiming, in the Hungarian mindset, reclaiming territory that was theirs. For example, there was a town called Novi Sad, N-O-V-I-S-A-D. This was in January 1942. 4,000 Jews and 6,000 Serbs were killed by Hungarians. The Hungarians may have actually, as they extended out beyond the town of Novi Sad, they may have actually killed as many as 15,000 people. Now, is that genocide? Maybe, but maybe not. Probably not, but it's definitely war crimes. There's no question about that. And it could also be ethnic cleansing. Is the Jewish component of that, since Hungary was then part of the Axis, is the Jewish component part of the Holocaust? Probably yes. So it's very weird that we would have to take one town, one example of a town, Novi Sad, And the 4,000 Jews, we're going to parse them separately from the Serbs, and we're going to attribute that 4,000, those 4,000 Jews to the Holocaust, and the 6,000 Serbs killed by the Hungarians to something else, to some other event. Maybe it's just wordplay and it doesn't matter, but they don't appear to be part of the Holocaust. They appear to be something either more about nationalism or ethnicity or just physical territory. We saw down here again, not part of Yugoslavia, but right in that area. Albanians, they were killed. Bulgarians, the Bulgarian military, at least 10,000. So in the end, it said that there were about almost 450,000 military deaths, somewhere between 500 and say 80, so almost 600,000, and 1.5 million civilian deaths. 57,000, all the way up to 312,000, and possibly more, were Holocaust-related deaths. The U.S. Holocaust Museum, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, considers the number 312,000 for Serbian deaths as part of the Holocaust, and I would absolutely take their word on that subject for sure. In addition, this is kind of odd. In addition, during the Holocaust, throughout Europe, approximately 220,000 gypsies, Sinti and Roma, were killed. What portion of them were killed in Yugoslavia? Which portion of those killed in Yugoslavia were killed attributable to the Holocaust or to something else? So that's why these numbers, once again, are extremely difficult to pinpoint. So what we're seeing here with Yugoslavia is that there was an occupation. There was an Italian occupation. There was a German occupation. There were rifts, civil wars, guerrilla warfare, all taking place under cover of World War II. The Axis pressured Yugoslavia to join the tripartite pact, the Italian, German, Japanese alliance, and they did. Yugoslavia joined reluctantly, but they felt pressure to do so. Immediately following the news that Yugoslavia had joined the Axis, there were mass demonstrations and there was an overthrow. That overthrow sent a message essentially to Hitler that said Yugoslavia, the Balkans, was unreliable, would be an unreliable area as an ally. So, as we see here, Germany, the Germans invade Yugoslavia, Greece as well, but they invade Yugoslavia. And the invasion was successful. It began April 6, 1941, and concluded a couple weeks later, April 17th, 1941. That is what led to the partitioning then of Yugoslavia, control of most of Serbia, creating an independent Croatia that was basically a puppet government, initially of the Italians, and then we'll see after the Italians leave the Axis, join the Allies, of Germany. Slovenia, the Dalmatian Coast, again, this area along the coast that Italy had craved for years, and Kosovo. So Serbia, independent Croatia, Slovenia, the Dalmatian Coast, and Kosovo, all given to Italy to be under Italy's control. And again, we've got a map here that shows the breakdown of the 9 regions and who took control. This is that Dalmatian Coast area that was annexed by Italy, although not all of it, some German. But you can see Italy gathers quite a bit of territory. And it makes sense in a way, logistically, I suppose. So Germany's goal, of course, was the complete destruction of the Yugoslavian military the dissolution and destruction of the company. Voila, we have it broken into 9 sectors. Almost from the start, Germany faced guerrilla warfare, guerrilla opposition or resistance. But the resistance wasn't coordinated. I suppose that's to be understood. It wasn't coordinated. Instead, it was actually 2 opposing forces who were only united in their opposition to the German and Italian occupation, but mostly the German occupation. They were united in their hatred of the German occupation, yet there were it was almost a civil strife between the two groups. Early on, in fact, Tito, who I mentioned, with the partisan communists, and Mihalovic, who I've not mentioned, but I did mention the Chetniks, they tried to unite and actually perform a few military engagements against the Germans together. But most of the time, they actually they fought one another. So the question, I mentioned Mihalovic, I mentioned Tito, and I want to add to that Pavlich. So who are those 3 people? Well, what we're going to do is look at each of them, and we're going to look at each of the groups that they control. So let's start with the Chetniks. Again, we talked about the Chetniks being irregular volunteers. All right, so let's start with our first group involved in World War II, the occupation by Germany and Italy, the civil strife and infighting, and yes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and possibly attempted ethnic cleansing. So we have the Chetniks. We have the Chetniks under a man named Draza Mihailovic. Draza Mihailovic. They were supported generally by the Serbs. They were typically still loyal to the monarchy that had existed. There were also remnants of the Yugoslav army and who supported the Chetniks, as did the government in exile. Here you have Time magazine with Mihailovic, Unconquered, and here you have the Chetniks in general. We'll see that there's actually at least three separate groups of Chetniks. All right, Chetniks that are regulars, and that title, that word comes from a Serbian nationalist organization that actually had resisted the Turks earlier on. They had fought well in World War I, and they still existed at the time of the German invasion as a reserve force. So they would be called up when needed. So think of a military reserve. So Chetnik is not an ethnic or linguistic group. It is a group of irregular volunteers. Mihailovic himself, earlier on, had been appalled by the execution of approximately 35,000 Serbian hostages that were killed for Chetnik, irregular volunteer-like activities during World War I. And he determined that they were going to avoid repetition of reprisals like that for any kind of premature rising of forces under his command. So therefore, the Chetnik operations were generally restricted to small-scale actions and sabotage. They didn't want to instigate or initiate or trigger retaliation as they had seen in World War I. So we said that Mihailovic, the Chetniks, Tito, the partisan communists, united at times, and that was against the Germans. The Chetniks were anti-German. Initially, they were strongly anti-German, but they became more pro-Yugoslavian. That's not to say that they allied themselves at all with the Germans, but that their focus had switched from anti-German to the future of Yugoslavia. So they became more pro-Yugoslavian. And to make matters worse and more confusing, like I said, the Chetniks were not a monolithic group. There were two other Chetnik groups that I mentioned. This was early on, and they would have morphed and blended and separated and come back together. But one of the Chetnik groups was supported by the government of Croatia, absolute arch enemy of Serbia. So the Serbian Chetniks and the Croatian Chetniks would have actually opposed Germany in unison and one another. There was a third Chetnik organization that was supported by Tito's partisan communists, who would have opposed Mihailovic, and the Croatians. So you can see how it's confusing. You can see how knowing the terminology is critical, because I'm throwing around these names, Mihailovic and Tito and Chetnik and Partisan and Ustasi and so forth. Can be confusing. It was bewildering to me until I really kind of dug into this. All right, so we know that the Chetniks at points killed Muslims, and that is entirely based on religion. So for example, in a southeastern town in Bosnia, the town of Foca, F-O-C-A, this was the end of December to January. So end of December 1941 into January 1942, the Chetniks actually massacred 2,000 plus Muslims. And then again, January through February of 1943, they massacred again in a southeast Bosnian town. They massacred approximately 10,000 Muslims. So we're talking about the Serbian Chetniks in southeast Bosnia, and the Chetniks and the Serbs would have been here, and Bosnia, southeastern Bosnia, would have been over here. So again, there's a territorial element to it for sure, that proximity element as well, but it was also strongly religious against the Muslims. So we have at least 12,000 Muslims killed in a couple-year period by these Chetniks. And is that ethnic cleansing? Yes, depending on which definition of ethnic cleansing we use. Is it war crimes? Yes, it was during war, absolutely. Crimes against humanity as well. So that is an initial, at least for the Chetniks, an initial violation of all three of the mass human rights violations. A quote from Mihailovic. He said, quote, "We are exterminating Ustasi whenever we find them." So we see that they focus their killing of an identified group of Muslims, and now we also see them exterminating a group based on their identity, and that was the Ustasi, who were generally Croatian, but also Catholic. So that's where we see, is it crimes against humanity? Is it war crimes? Is it an ethnic cleansing idea? It just, the definitions meld quite a bit. Nevertheless, Mihailovic, who we'll see was as we can see here on Time Magazine, and we'll see shortly, definitely was kind of a darling of the American media initially. There was a major guerrilla group performed by the Chetniks in 1941 against the Italians in Montenegro. So down here in Montenegro, an Italian protectorate. This was in July 13th, 1941. The Montenegrins swarmed Italian garrisons that were scattered throughout that really mountainous state of Montenegro. The Italians were surprised, they were destroyed, or they were driven out and thrown back. And it took about a year for the Italians to reclaim all that territory and to quell the uprising that was taking place. They accomplished that by actually utilizing some Chetniks. The result for the Montenegrins was 15,000 dead or wounded, and an additional 10,000 who were shipped off for forced labor. So now when we see the word forced labor come in, that reminds us, first of all, of the Holocaust, second of all, of Session 2, Cambodia, third, Session 3, Mexico and the Mexican Revolution with forced labor, and is absolutely an example of crimes against humanity and war crimes by Italy. So we're talking about the Chetniks. What did they do when they captured enemy soldiers? They captured Nazis, Italian soldiers, and others. Well, they often killed them outright, or they were killed during interrogation. The Chetniks were responsible for killing at least between 50 and 100,000 Croats, Muslims, and others during the war years that took place in Yugoslavia, 1941 to 1945. They probably killed at the higher range. Between 1941 and 1943, the Chetniks were supported by the Allies. And just one element to kind of describe here visually, the support that the Chetniks had with the Allies between 41 and 43. We have comic books, and the comic books refer to Draza Mihailovic as the Yugoslav MacArthur. You notice the image here of Mihailovic. You notice Time Magazine's image of Mihailovic. You notice a photograph of the Chetniks. Mihailovic here is, it almost seems like he's Americanized in a way, with the short crew cut and the glasses and the strong jawline and so forth. It almost looks like they're, well, this is propaganda, right? The Yugoslav MacArthur, he's a handsome, strong-looking man. He's a leader. And the fighting Chetniks here, this cartoon or this comic book is interesting, and it's got all the elements that you would expect of propaganda. You have the strong, fierce Chetniks. He's taken, this man here has taken the Nazi banner and he's using it as a weapon against the Nazi. And if you look at the Nazis' faces, it's almost like they're monstrous or ape-like. Again, propaganda, pro-Chetnik, anti-Nazi, and it makes total sense. Chains that bind and secure, and of course, it is most likely a blonde-haired, beautiful woman who's being held by the Nazis. And so here is support for the fighting Chetniks. They're just like us. They're strong. They're the good guys. From 1941 to 1943. And we'll see what happens from there. The second group, who was involved in crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, were the communists. So I refer to them as the partisan communists, and they were also known as the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, or the Partisan Detachments of Yugoslavia. It's much easier to just refer to them as partisan communists, and I think that's what I'll stick with from here on out. We see Tito, who becomes Marshal Tito, who was born Josip Broz. He was in full command by 1943. The PLA was supported by the people to a degree. Tito had converted to communism while being a prisoner of war of the Russians during the Red Revolution. So was it willing, or was it a forced conversion? He had been the Secretary General of the Communists in Yugoslavia since 1937. So from 37 all the way through to 1980, he was a strong, talented leader of the communists in Yugoslavia. Tito was extremely aggressive toward the Germans and, frankly, anyone who was not supportive of the communist cause, and that included the Chetniks. Now, the strong communist sympathies are obvious here when you see the CCCP, the red star. When you see the red star here once again, so there's a strong, obvious red flag, strong statement of Tito and the communists, the partisan communists. All right, so I said that he was, that Tito and the partisan communists were aggressive toward the Germans. It's possible that between April and May of 1941, that they killed 100,000 people who opposed communism. So Tito, very much a pro-communist, pro-Yugoslavia, anti-German, pro-communist person. Tito was actually forced to try to keep those 9 regions together, united. The communists in each of those 9 regions, to keep them united. Adding to the difficulty and demonstrating the man's talent was that up to this point, still, Germany and Russia were allies. And to add to it, Germany and Russia had that non-aggression pact in place until 1941, until June of 1941. Now, once Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, took place, Tito was then unleashed to fight Germany and Germany's allies, the Ustasi and even Slovene or Slovenian fascists. Tito had to move around, and one of his early bases of operation was actually in Slovenia, where they had a kill non-communist elements rule. Anyone who was not supportive of communism was therefore the enemy. So, example, in response to a Soviet threat to anyone who resisted the party, over a 4-day period in September, a couple years later, September 1943, 7,000 white guard traitors, in quotes, traitors, were, quote, actually erased from Slovenian soil, end quote. That was by Tito's partisan communists, and it was supported by and actually promoted by the Soviet Union. That kind of action, the killing of soldiers who surrendered, is an obvious violation of war crimes. It's not ethnic cleansing. I've mentioned ethnic cleansing and the fact that it doesn't have a legally accepted definition. There are two working definitions that people work with. One is the rendering of an area ethnically homogeneous through force or intimidation to remove the persons of that area. A second and similar definition is a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove, through violence and terror, a civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. So the idea of cleaning a geographic area of an ethnicity. So we will see elements for sure of that. In this case here, the killing of those 7,000 Slovene white guard, National Guardsmen, was a violation of war crimes. And again, it's always important to remember that genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing all blend to one another, and there are elements of each sometimes. Sometimes you could almost say it's all four. Tito later moved to Zagreb, where he took orders directly via a secret transmitter from Moscow. So Yugoslavia and Moscow, Tito in Yugoslavia, the leader of the communists there, was in communication directly with Moscow. From the start, Tito and the partisan communists used guerrilla tactics against the Germans. And that led to reprisals by the Germans against civilians. So that's an example, absolutely, of war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. So regarding those reprisals, German General Keitel wrote, quote, "In order to nip disorders in the bud, the sternest measures must be applied at the first sign of insurrection. It should also be taken into consideration that in the countries in question, a human life is often valueless," end quote. And that is that concept, once again, the valuelessness, which goes directly, in this case, to the German concept, or the German understanding of eugenics. And it fits in with our working idea of that a lack of respect for human life is either a cause or a contributor to genocide and the mass human rights violations, or conversely, a sign that a society has become so depraved that a genocide and or a mass human rights violations is potential. Keitel continued, the German general, Keitel continued, quote, "In a reprisal for the life of a German soldier, the general rule should be capital punishment for 50 to 100 communists. The manner of execution must have a frightening effect," end quote. Examples that Keitel's orders were taken to heart: 6,000 innocents shot in a town called Makva, M-A-C-V-A, 7,000 in a town called Kraljevo, K-R-A-L-J-E-V-O, and 2,300 at another town, Kragujevac. And again, apologies on the pronunciation. That's K-R-A-G-U-J-E-V-A-C. So this is like we saw in the Cambodian genocide. This ironically had a different effect. The Germans were getting revenge, but they were also, like the Cambodians did, they were driving the people that they were trying to control to their enemy. In this case, they were driving the people to Tito and the partisan communists. War crimes, absolutely. Possibly crimes against humanity. So Tito and the partisan communists were supported by the Soviet Union. Remember that we said the Chetniks were supported by the Allies from 41 to 43. We'll put it this way. Tito and the partisan communists were supported by the Soviet Union from 41 to 43. Then the Tehran Conference took place, and USSR, the Soviets, convinced the Allies to no longer support the Chetniks, but now to support the communists. So the great fighting Chetniks under the Yugoslav MacArthur were valuable from 41 to 43. The Russians then convinced the Allies to now support the communists. And it doesn't seem to make sense. The only thing that makes sense to me about this is an example of the enemy of my enemy is, at least temporarily, my friend. And I say temporarily because we'll see more changes, of course, along the way. Another example of that, of the enemy of my enemy, took place in June of 1944. There was actually an attempt to consolidate the Chetniks and the communists. In fact, or the partisan communists. In fact, it was formalized. It really didn't have a hope because both groups' vision of the future of Yugoslavia was so dramatically different. The Chetniks still held the idea of a monarchy, and Tito and the partisan communists held the idea of communism. And so this was doomed to fail, and in fact did. Back in 1941, in Montenegro, the partisan communists, quote, staged indiscriminate executions and hurled the bodies into ravines. And because of that, the Montenegrin Chetniks called the partisan communists, quote, pitman, P-I-T-M-A-N, pitman. So we see what's taking place here. Under this German and Italian occupation, we have a civil war. Citizens were targeted. Citizens were killed by the partisan communists for the crime of owning land. Others for their religious attendance, others for being fat, and therefore they were bourgeois. So this is the communist side coming out. As the Nazi defeat became more obvious, the partisan communists switched from their anti-German focus to domestically purging enemies and those who were less enthusiastic communists. And that is absolutely reminiscent of Session 2 and what took place in Cambodia. Same idea of purges, purging enemies within the country, and that even included enemies who were part of your group. They just weren't as enthusiastic, in this case, as enthusiastic communists. Order number 416 was issued in 1943, and it demanded an understanding of Marxism by all people conscripted into the partisan communist detachments. Quote, all those who don't know much about the history of communism and show no interest must be liquidated, end quote. That's according to Politkommissar Novak, N-O-V-A-K, Novak. And of course, he went on to add that the liquidations needed to be discreet. Lastly, or not lastly, but additionally, enemies lists were drawn up in the tens of thousands. And of course, that would lead to war crimes while the war was taking place, and then after, crimes against humanity. So how did the communist partisans treat prisoners? Well, just like the Chetniks did. That was to kill them outright, to kill them during interrogation, generally speaking. So an example, a former member of the Central Command noted that when the Italians were holding a town and it surrendered, forced their surrender. Quote, all the Italian troops, the entire 3rd Battalion of the 259th Regiment of the Murge, M-U-R-G-E, Murge Division were put to death. That's an example of war crimes. They had surrendered and they were put to death. The partisans also used reprisal, just like the Nazis did. Their twist on it was, for every partisan communist lost, 10 traitors, therefore anti-communists of any sort, were to be killed, with the object being to instill terror. So shockingly, and in support of this idea, once again, of a lack of valuing human life, and also to support the idea of the ends justify the means, the partisans ambushed and killed. They'd kill a few Nazi soldiers. They might blow up a car, something like that, intentionally to invite retaliation. They would ensure that the attack took place in an area, however, that was anti-communist or their enemy's area of operation. So therefore the retaliation was actually against their enemy. So the partisan communists killed some Germans, their enemy, and invited retaliation against their internal enemies. So the partisan communists displayed an almost universal disregard for what were generally accepted customs and usages of war. Hospitals, for example, were not off limits. Ambulance convoys, hospital trains, they were all easy targets, and they were not off limits to the partisan communists. The sick and the wounded were slain in their beds. War crimes violations. The medical stores were looted. Doctors or other medical medical personnel were often kidnapped, carried along with the partisan communists to tend to any sick and wounded guerrillas. Because of war, there was a shortage of clothing, of course, and the necessity of obtaining uniforms for purposes also of disguise became a common practice. So corpses were stripped. Extremists among the partisans actually mutilated the downed soldier, dead or alive, and stripped their clothes. That was a sense of personal vengeance, I guess. Those types of acts of terrorism incurred savage retaliation by the Germans and their allies. So now we're adding war crime to war crime, crime against humanity to crime against humanity. Savagery. Yes, it's war, it's genocide, it's civil war. The hundreds or even thousands who were killed in reprisal were, per the partisan communists, would hopefully eliminate some of their the partisans' enemies. Or it would have the effect, again, of driving people who were not sure which direction to go, would drive the people to the partisan communists, so they would bring more people into their philosophy, into their group, into their troops as well. Sometimes, I mean, they took it to a point, the partisan communists would actually leave Nazi loot, guns, uniforms, things that they'd taken in a raid, and leave them in anti-communist areas to draw reprisal. So they used tactics that were definitely not tactics that were considered traditional ways of behaving during a war. So we talked about reprisal. 12 German soldiers were killed in a town in 1941. The Nazis executed between 4,000 and 8,000 inhabitants of a town. I mentioned the name of the town, Kragujeva, Kragujeva, between 4,000 and 8,000 inhabitants in reprisal for the 12 soldiers who were killed. So that gives you an idea about the idea of reprisal. The partisan communists, in addition to the other groups I mentioned that they killed, they also killed landlords, those who were seen as wealthy, the rich, aristocrats, and so forth. So here's a quote that is really reminiscent of what we saw in session 2 in Cambodia, and even the idea of the kulak which goes to the Holodomor, which we talked about in session 1 as an example. We didn't do the Armenian Genocide there, but we did talk about the idea of the kulak, or land owner. So here's a quote. An old communist, a name that I cannot pronounce, an old communist and member of the Agitprop team had been at Piva in Montenegro visiting a youth organization. The cell secretary gave a report which mentioned that they had executed a rich peasant, in quotes. An informer or collaborator, I suppose, asked the man I mentioned. Not at all, replied the secretary. He went on. He even donated regularly to our funds, but we had to execute him. You see, he was a kulak, and one day he would have been our enemy. The man who was visiting was shaken, was visibly shaken, and he started to remonstrate the secretary, but the secretary cut him off. No, and he pointed to a little boy who was sitting there, and quote, he said, quote, "That is his son. He also voted for his father's execution. You ask him," end quote. And the boy nodded. Very, very reminiscent of Cambodia, where we saw exactly the same thing. In November of 1943, the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, very long name, or AVNOJ, declared itself the supreme government of Yugoslavia, and Tito was made prime minister. Even though the partisan communists only controlled 10% of the population. Tito was even recognized by the prime minister in exile, a doctor named Dr. Subasic, S-U-B-A-S-I-C-H, who actually told everyone to support Tito, and those who didn't would be excluded from the future government. So by that point, 3 years prior to Tito being recognized, being recognized as prime minister, the partisan communists were reckoned to have killed at least 100,000 people. Again, that would include Germans, that would include anti-communists in their view. All right, so we move forward. The Soviet Red Army took Belgrade in October of 1944, and the partisans then were able to mop up and hunted and killed collaborators who were also known as collaborationists, those who had collaborated with the enemy. With the war ending and Tito taking over Croatia and Zagreb, there were large-scale massacres that followed. There was another doctor who was visiting, Dr. Giuseppe Masucci, secretary to the Vatican's envoy in Croatia, and that man kept a diary. He compared Zagreb at that time that he was there to a huge cemetery and noted en masse deaths. In November of 1945, he wrote very, very dramatically, "Bitter tears are flowing without pause. New punishments continuously send men to their death by hanging. The entire land is inundated by streams of tears. After the massacres of several 100,000 Croatian soldiers and civilians in the first months of the communist regime, shootings and hangings still are being carried out day in and day out. Evidently, this policy of mass execution is that of the new regime rather than a series of acts committed by irresponsible elements. There is no one who does not mourn someone." So this is just, the war ends in May of 45. Here we are, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So 6 months later, the communist regime of Tito has now taken over. And this man is talking about several 100,000 people massacred in a state of terror. So collaborators, as such, were hunted down all over Yugoslavia. An example: 1,700 young men were recruited into the Croatian army right before the war's end. They weren't given orders. They were barely given training. They were gathered together in a town called Virovitica, Virovitica, and they were killed. There were 400 inhabitants of a town called Gospic, Gospic. They were killed. One Ustasi, who we'll talk about next, who were vicious and vile, no question, but one Ustasi man, I forgot to give a graphic warning at the beginning of this, graphic warning in the description of what happened to this man. One Ustasi man was skinned alive and hung from a tree by his own skin. That horrible, macabre, bizarre creativity of how to hurt other people rears its head here once again. Fearing the logical end of the war, thousands of civilians, Chetniks, Ustasi, Slovenian White Guard, civilians and others fled to the Austrian border. They preferred going to the border and surrendering to the British than remaining in Yugoslavia to face the wrath of Tito and the partisan communists. So here's where things take another strange, very strange twist and turn. This could be an interest. This is the Blyberg Massacre I mentioned, and the British, the Allies, the British role in what will follow here, and Britain's role. It might be a neat area for students to focus on. It might be a way for students to focus on this huge, overwhelming topic with a more palatable, manageable series of events. This goes to the highest level of the British government, which decided to return most of those people who were fleeing Yugoslavia, intentionally going to Austria, intentionally to surrender to the British, and return those people directly back to the partisans, to Yugoslavia. So in May of 1945, war is just ending. The British Fifth Corps turned over 18,500 civilians, former soldiers and guerrillas, not all good guys, I'm not saying that, but they turned them over to the partisan communists, despite the fact that the partisan communists had made it known that they were going to be merciless to the prisoners upon the receipt of them. A group called the Welsh Guards returned 5,000 Croats to the partisans, and other units as well handed over thousands and so forth. Most of those numbers I'm mentioning, 18,500, 5,000 Croats, thousands more, most of them were massacred by the partisan communists for their anti-communist stance. Another example, there was a mile of forest called Bretzovia. Between 5,000 and 10,000 were killed there. These statistics start to go to Tito, the communists, and the time frame of post-World War II all the way through his death in 1980. In May of 45, 5,000 Serbian Chetniks, between 12 and 15,000 Croats and Slovenes were being held in a place called St. Vid. They were taken to the Kamnik Mountains, and they were massacred by machine gun as their bodies fell into anti-tank trenches. 10,000 others were killed the same way. So we're looking at possibly 25,000 people killed just there. Tens of thousands were marched on death marches. And of course, death marches we saw in Cambodia, and we saw actually in Mexico in the Mexican Revolution. The numbers of people dwindle the longer the death march goes on. Makes sense based on the name. Those marches last days, weeks, and even months. They would go through villages, and just like we saw in session 1 with the Armenian, when we touched on the Armenian Genocide, and we'll see again when we focus entirely on the Armenian Genocide, that inhabitants of villages were encouraged to come out and beat and rob and attack and steal from the people who were being marched through their town. Approximately 5% of the refugees survived those marches. approximately, one number I saw was 300,000 had been murdered on those death marches. And that didn't include Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs who stayed home, who remained in their villages and had already been killed. The number is impossible. That's why the number I said at the end was somewhere between 1 million and 1.6 million. Virtually impossible to know. The British were involved. Like I said, the British were involved. They turned back tens of thousands of refugees who were at this river, the River Drava in Austria. A former partisan general named Kosta Nadj, N-A-D-J, in January of 1985, was being interviewed, and he said that of the 150,000 people given or falling into their hands, just of his Third Army alone, quote, naturally, in the end, we liquidated them, end quote. So we've seen the word exterminate, we've seen the word liquidate. Reminiscent of the Holocaust? Absolutely is. Reminiscent of the Holocaust. Other people suggested that as many as 300,000 may have been murdered. And again, that didn't include the people who remained in their villages. A quizzical understatement by a Tito Politburo member about this issue, about the British giving back, returning people. Quote, to be quite frank with you, we didn't at all understand why the British insisted on returning these people, end quote. Here we see Tito. We've seen a progression of Tito from early on, his allegiance to communism. Here he is now as Marshal Tito in 1948. Here he is as Marshal Tito in 1949. And then we see here Marshal Tito, Yugoslavia's Tito, Marshal Tito. We see him almost deified in a way. And once again, as always, that Russian star, prominent. By June 1st of 1945, the British had returned to Yugoslavia, at least pushing over 12,000 Croats, 5,500 or so Serbs, 8,200 Slovenes, 400 Montenegrins. The Blyberg Massacre that I mentioned, 100,000 Croat troops and civilians who'd fled to Austria because they didn't want to be under the communists, they didn't want to face reprisal. They gathered in a field outside of Blyberg, Austria, and they thought they were surrendering to the British. They had their hands in the air. They were waving white flags, which is a direct, if people waving a white flag are killed, that's a direct violation of war crimes. So an agreement had been made that the British were going to turn them over to the Yugoslavians. But instead, the British weren't actually there. It was the partisans to whom the Croats, civilians, and troops were surrendering. And they were machine gunned down in huge numbers. Now, the British were nearby. And from what I understand, it's unknown whether they were aware or not that a massacre was taking place. Those who were not machine gunned down, were stabbed, were cut, were beaten to death, and then a remnant of Croats that survived were marched back to Yugoslavia on those death marches. Very reminiscent of the Holocaust. Along the way, bodies were thrown into ravines. This brings up the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, the Mexican Revolution, the Cambodian Genocide, and it seems as though the idea, the concept of death marches is a common feature of genocide and mass human rights violations. There's something almost about parading your prisoners that seems to be common across different ethnicities, different nationalities, and different time frames. We have the Armenian Genocide in the 1915s. We have the Holocaust in the 1930s, 40s. We have the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s up to 1920, the Cambodian Genocide in the 70s. And yet we see in each of those examples, including now Yugoslavia in the 40s, this idea of death marches. So another eyewitness account example was near a town called Kochevje, Kocevje, where a partisan who had defected overheard executioners talking about having killed between 30 and 40,000 people over an 8-day period. So now the 10 months between Tito's government being legalized and the end of the war, World War II, Tito and the partisan communists are alleged to have killed between 300,000 and 750,000 Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, German prisoners, and the killing of collaborators and anti-communists continued after the war. So we're gonna pick up with Tito on the tracker from that will really cover his career. Others who suffered under Tito and the partisan communists included 200 nuns and priests who were executed. Now, we hear that and we think that is absolutely horrific, and it is. However, some of those 200 nuns and priests were actively, physically engaged in massacres by the Ustasi. These are obviously devout Catholics who were involved in physical torture and murder. So they were executed for, pardon the pun, but they were executed for their sins, according to the partisan communists. Tito and the partisan communists even illegally occupied Trieste in Italy for a month and a half or so, 40 days or so. During that time, they arrested thousands of people and killed something between 10 and 15,000 people in Trieste and neighboring regions, and this was in Italy. The post-war purges that I just mentioned continued, and settling of accounts became a kind of a governing principle under Tito. Now, setting this aside, the special note, ethnic Germans were targeted. That is a whole subject unto itself. In fact, we're going to be doing a session dedicated exclusively to ethnic Germans and Austrians who were driven from surrounding countries back to Austria or back to Austrian Germany, including by boxcar, at the end of the war as retribution for the sins of their countrymen. So during the settling of accounts, it even included collaborators, of course, but also people who were simply poor peasants who hadn't collaborated, who had just survived. Generally, places were looted, women were sexually assaulted, people were outright murdered in the tens or thousands, and tens of thousands were also put into camps where they died. So the use of concentration camps. So this looting, raping, murder, and concentration camps, again, all reminiscent of the Holocaust, reminiscent of the Armenian Genocide, reminiscent of Cambodia, although the camps were more the killing fields. The Committee for the Protection of the People, or the OZNA, started to slow the killing towards the end of 1945. Even Marshal Tito had objected to this growing death toll. Tito's objection and that reprieve did not apply, though, to the concentration camps that were located throughout Yugoslavia and were under the control of the partisan communists. To that end, there's a man named Frank Wadhams, a Brit who was living outside of Belgrade, and he allegedly knew of numerous concentration camps and had talked with inmates from nearly all of them. For example, there were many Slovenes who were released from German camps in Germany. They were returned to Yugoslavia, where they were immediately put into Yugoslavian camps. Quote, and this is regarding Frank Wadhams and what he heard, and quote, "It is from these people that the news has come that the camps are worse than Dachau," end quote. Now, we don't like obviously to do comparisons of pain, comparisons of which is worse, that kind of thing. When it regards to people, this is an interesting parallel, however, to Dachau. of approximately the 1.2 or so million Slovenes, Wadhams reckoned that somewhere between 20 and say 30,000 were imprisoned. Into 1948, the communists actually added a new group to the concentration camps. Those were known as the Commonformists. Those were communists who sided with Stalin and or the Soviet Union. Common form is com for communists and international. So these are the international communists. And Tito and Yugoslavia, by this point, have separated from Russia and were doing their own form of communism, not as part of the Soviet Union. And it's kind of interesting in a way. Tito's brand of communism was more of a national communism. And it's kind of like Mussolini's National Socialism. So Mussolini was the son of an ardent, active socialist. Mussolini himself was an ardent, active socialist. Mussolini's fascism was essentially National Socialism. Or national communism. He believed in socialism and communism, but he believed that it was national, that this was for Italy. And so he focused inwardly as opposed to international communism. So it was not, in Mussolini's eyes, it was not workers of the world unite, it was Italian workers unite, still under the flag of communism, but unite for Italy. So a national communism versus an international communism. And in a way, Tito is doing his own national communism as well. So the Commonformists were rounded up, and of course, I keep saying this, the tens of thousands. They were tortured, they were killed, and or sent to concentration camps. This included even Tito's personal bodyguard, who was given a life sentence of hard labor, a commander of a security guard of the Supreme Headquarters, who died mysteriously, the Deputy Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, who died mysteriously, the Deputy Prime Minister of Croatia, etc. There's a long list of people who died mysteriously or disappeared. One allegedly for the crime of commenting on the comeliness of his wife's legs. All right, so many people were tortured, imprisoned, and that included a long list of officials who were under Tito, including high-ranking military. This is a national purge. So when we think of purges, we think of the SA, the Sturmabteilung in Germany, at the beginning of Hitler's reign and the beginning of the Holocaust, the purge of the SA, or the SA. We think of also the internal purges by the Khmer Rouge in the Cambodian genocide. We even think of the Porfirio Diaz government dictatorship in Mexico pre-revolution. And there were also others who subsequently took power after Diaz, leading up to Obregón, that's session 3 in Mexico, who also utilized the idea of internal purges. So this is a commonality, it seems like, for genocides and mass human rights violations. 8,000 communists were arrested and sent to concentration camps, but innocent people were picked up as well. So here's an example. In a village in Montenegro, a peasant was killed from protesting. He said, quote, "You eat white bread while we have none," end quote, and he was killed for that. That sounds a lot like in the Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, for the people, I think 3 people were marching in a parade, and because it was the opposition party, they were killed for that. They were killed for marching in a parade for their candidate. There was an infamous, we could call it a hellhole, I think is acceptable to say. So an infamous hellhole where those Commonformists were generally held, and that was called Goli Otok. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. GoliOtok. That was located off that Dalmatian coast. That is a notorious partisan communist concentration camp, designed specifically for that, constructed for that explicit purpose. 15,000 prisoners were held there at one time or another. And some were actually for serving time for pro-Soviet sympathies. So they were pro-Soviet communist, they just weren't they were communists, they just weren't pro-Yugoslavian communists. 50,000 or so prisoners may have gone through there, and of course many of those people were innocent. Here's a quote in that vein. So we're talking about in a camp. So here's an example. In a camp, a peasant who, after selling his wheat at the market, went to a tavern for a drink. A stranger asked him, quote, "Uncle, if you have 2 glasses, one of which is Russia and full, the other of which is Yugoslavia and empty, from which one would you drink?" "From the full one, of course," he answered. So he suffered for that. He wasn't a politician. So that gives you an example of the kind of low level of crime, that's in quotes because that wasn't a crime, but that could land a person in this place, this Goli Otok. Here's an example. Also there was the colonel, and he's the one who said about Tito's third wife, Jovanka, that her legs were, quote, sexy. Also the general who was betrayed by his own children. His own small children betrayed this general for shooting at the portrait of Tito. As you can imagine, the conditions at that facility were awful: foul food, brutal labor, torture, and few people returned unscathed physically and or mentally, for sure. The communist purges that followed the war, and we were up to 1948, saw 220,000 trials, show trials. That's in 1948 alone. That number was cut significantly to 160,000 the following year in 1949. And overall, perhaps 1 million people went through the prison system. And perhaps a million people went through that prison system. And, quote, "Everyone lived in fear, no one knowing when fabricated charges might be brought against him, leading to imprisonment and trial." End quote. Absolutely replicating what we saw with the Khmer Rouge. Numbers are unknown during the purge, but there's an estimate between the end of World War II, 1945, up to 1963, that the death toll in prisons and camps was somewhere between a low of 60,000 and a high of 200,000. Of course, as you can imagine, following the end of the war, and then with this period of consolidation of Tito's power, but also of chaos, that unrest followed. So, for example, in the winter of 1948-1949, there was an armed rebellion against Tito's rule. It was done by another regional communist party. Tito used tanks and artillery and put the rebellion down. The leaders of the rebellion were pursued. They were literally pursued into forests, and they were hunted down. And whether they surrendered or not, they were killed. Quote, "Yet not a single one made it back into town alive. All were killed en route." And that is very reminiscent of something we talked about, session 3, the Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, the concept of ley fuga, Leyfuga. And it's basically the idea of a prisoner attempting to escape. And once the prisoner attempts to escape, it's fair game to shoot him. So occurring pretty much simultaneously with that communist rebellion was a Muslim-oriented rebellion. It was a small 500 to 600 peasants from all sorts of different villages. It failed, kind of closed shop and returned back home. But many ran into the forest where they too were pursued and shot. Years later, in that same area, a number of villages were there, this is in 1952, were burned to the ground as a result of a rebellion for reprisal. Now, it was foreign aid, the presence of foreign aid, that led Tito to abandon forced labor in camps. So like we saw in Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, Cambodian Genocide, and the Holocaust. Between 1945 and 1952 is considered to be the most repressive period under Tito. Although there was a reemergence, a spike in 1955 that saw a bunch of executions in the Muslim Kosovo. That was to quash a burgeoning sense of unrest that was taking place there. Even in 1966 and the 70s. In 1966, a longtime Tito friend and former head of his security police, Tito's security police, was dismissed. And in the 70s, there was an assassination attempt of a Yugoslavian state security person, and that resulted in the execution of 20 political emigres. So this violence went all the way up into the 1970s. So for World War II, civilian war deaths attributed to Tito's communist partisans, I mean, a number of 100,000, but we've seen that number is probably way off, but that's a number that's often attributed. I think the number is virtually impossible to determine. The post-war period, the communists are alleged to have killed 570 former Ustasi. Those were the Catholics from Croatia, generally. Croat soldiers, regular Croatian soldiers. Nazi POWs, still, this is post-war, immediately post-war for the Nazi POWs. Ethnic Germans, Slovenian White Guards, anti-communists, communist conformists, in other words, communists who were aligned with Soviet style, with Stalin style, collaborators, those who had worked with the occupying forces of Italy and Germany, Chetniks, intellectuals, the bourgeois, the landlords, the rich, the peasants, rebels, critics, innocents, the list went on and on. It's reckoned that between 1944 and 1980, Tito's end, at least 1 million people were killed. The war's end, 1945, brought a referendum, and he who was to be king, Peter II, was deposed in favor of Tito, who ended up proclaiming a new nation, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. So now going back to the Chetniks and Mihailovic, sure enough, Mihailovic was captured in 1946. There was another show trial, and his anti-communist stance was used against him to make him look like he was pro-German. We saw that he was actually pro-monarchy, but it didn't matter because this was a show trial. Not shockingly, he was found guilty and shortly thereafter executed. So we've talked about the Chetniks, we've talked about the partisan communists. Now we're going to talk about probably the more well-known of the groups that were involved in Yugoslavia at the time, and that is the Ustasi. This group not only did not resist the German occupation and the Italian occupation, they supported it. And due to that support, the independent state of Croatia was born, and it was led by Ustasi leader Ante Pavelić. So here's our third man. We have Mihailovic, Tito, and now Pavelić. The independent state of Croatia was actually a puppet of the Italian government, as we talked about. All right, so the independent state of Croatia, we see it was first an Italian puppet state and then a German puppet state. So why did they change from Italian to German is due to when Italy left the Axis in September 1943, and then they actually joined the Allies. So that was the change. And here we see stamps, and that is Ante Pavelić on it. He did not seem to make Time, Life, or Newsweek magazine covers as the other two did. From the start, the Ustasi implemented German-like anti-Jewish laws using Germany's approach as a model. So they combined Germany's fascism, but the thing that really made them different from the Nazis was they added a staunch adherence to Catholicism, to religion, and it was Catholicism. The Nazis really abhorred religion and were trying to eliminate religion along the way. But the Ustasi actually used German-like fascism, and they inculcated their Catholicism with it. The Ustasi deported Jews to extermination camps located in Poland under Germany's authority. And they actually paid 30 marks per Jew to be deported to those camps. So their disdain for the Jews was not just a sense of practicality. They really had a hatred for them based on race and other things. Again, the Ustasi thought that they were a more superior race that were more related to an ancient Viking group of Goths, which meant they were more alongside, more kin with the Germans. Remember, we said the Ustasi in Croatia was oriented towards Germany anyway, and so we can see a result of that orientation. All right, so that deportation of Jews to those extermination camps, is that genocide? Absolutely. It's not only genocide, it is part of the Holocaust. That is part of the Holocaust for sure. And it also, we'll see along the way that the Ustasi are involved in crimes against humanity, war crimes, and again, using those loose definitions, ethnic cleansing. So the independent state of Croatia included Croatia, but also some Serbian provinces, Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will hear from Bosnia and Herzegovina in session 5 in the modern, the 90s and the 2000s, our recent history with a direct landline back to this. Anyway, and they also, a couple of other areas as well. So the independent state of Croatia grew by absorbing territory. That put 6.2 million people under the Ustasi/puppet regime rule. And that included a substantial number of Serbs, and that will have immediate and then long-term effects, as I just mentioned. So a German recapitulation of casualties sustained by the Yugoslav guerrillas from the beginning of occupation to July of 1942 estimated that at least 45,000 dead, with thousands more sent off to forced labor in Germany and other occupied areas, including Norway, or detained in internment camps. So the important thing is that Germany utilized here, they killed, they sent to forced labor, and they detained in internment camps. Absolute violation, of course, of war crimes and the latter of those crimes against humanity. And this is the persecution by the Germans of the Holocaust. Neither Pavlich nor the Italian forces in Croatia coped very well with the widespread activities of the Chetniks. So, of course, the much better performing German troops were sent in to help with the fight. The Germans, however, forced area officials to remain in office to present a local face. The problem was that the other locals saw the officials who remained in office as puppets of Germany, and therefore collaborators. And they were viewed that way by Chetniks and by the partisan communists. So of those officials who were forced to remain in office, 58 were murdered during the first quarter of 1943 alone. 197 town halls were burned or damaged because of this. Of course, we talked about German reprisal. German reprisal for those actions included burning villages, levying fines in livestock, of course, the shooting of hostages in the hundreds from among those arrested of suspicion of being members or supporters of Chetniks or partisan movements, all of which are war crimes. Now, I said way earlier in the beginning that it would be great if this were tidy, if the history were tidy, but here's an example of it not being so, not being rigid, not being tidy. One Ustassi massacre. So the Ustasi, the superior race, more akin with the German Aryans, at least in their minds. The military units of the independent state of Croatia in eastern Bosnia consisted of regular units of the Croatian Home Guard and members of the local Muslim population, who were also recruited into units of Ustasi militia. And these Muslims then were actually distinguished themselves because of their persecution of Serbs. So their ancient ongoing battle between the Muslims and the Serbs, the Orthodox Serbs, allowed or propelled the Muslims to really persecute the Serbs. And they did that from the beginning of the war on. In fact, many Serbians considered all Muslims and all Croats to be Ustasi. And they threatened to kill them to avenge Serbs who were killed in a town I shan't attempt to pronounce. And in a way, this idea of having a Muslim force in the Croatian military aligned with the Italians and the Germans, it kind of defies in a way that racially pure idea, or is it more an example again of the enemy of my enemy is my friend and expediency? If you've heard the term or the name the Ustasi, you know that they were known for their brutality. They would slaughter, they would burn to death in churches, slaughter, shoot, hang, cut, stab, saw people in just incredibly despicable ways at an area called Korenica. Hundreds of persons were killed, but before they died, many of them had their ears and noses cut off, and then they were compelled to graze in the meadow. The tortures most frequently applied were beatings, severing of limbs, gouging of eyes, and breaking of bones. Cases are related of men being forced to hold red-hot bricks, to dance on barbed wire with naked feet, to wear a wreath of thorns. Needles were stuck under fingernails. Lighted matches were held under their noses. Of the murders on the large scale in a village called Carito, 103 peasants were severely tortured, tied in bundles, and thrown in a pit. Then gasoline was poured over all their bodies and ignited. The Ustasi were known for their violence and their viciousness. Another example is from the famous Ustasi death camp. They had many, but one of the death camps, Jasehovac, Jasehovac, maybe Jasehovac, possibly or probably, where 100,000 Serbs and political opponents were murdered. An 11-year-old Serbian Orthodox girl was captured as her family escaped Belgrade, and she was taken to that concentration camp. And this is a chilling quote from a minister from Chile who was visiting there regarding this 11-year-old Serbian girl. She was obliged to sleep in the rain on the snow. At first, she still possessed her own clothes, but these too the Ustasi took. Without clothes and famished, she began her descent into the hell beyond Dante's dreams. A little further on, the child one day attended a cruel spectacle. 40 students were smothered and then burnt. Another time, the Ustasi drove a hot iron rod into a man's head. Sometimes women were quartered, and to vary the spectacle, arms instead of legs were torn off. The quote goes on, but I'm purposefully skipping parts of this that, believe it or not, are incredibly more brutal than the things I've just quoted. Further down regarding this 11-year-old girl, to which the Chilean minister refers to as our heroine. Our heroine passed 2 whole days bound to a tree. To be more certain that she did not escape, her hair was attached to the trunk. Another time she hung for 4 hours, head down. Then for 2 hours she was tied by the hair to a branch where she swung back and forth. Another time she was left head down, where she was kept hanging for a whole day. Her hair was also tied to her feet, and she was obliged to remain in this position for an entire night. Sometimes, for a change, the Ustasi made a sort of trestle with red-hot iron and forced the children to sit on it astride. Again, I'm skipping more of that brutal graphic quote, but it gives you an idea. It gives you an idea of the brutality, and I think in a way that is why, well, the fact that they were allied with the Germans and this brutality is why the Ustasi are probably better known, more notoriously known than the Chetniks or the partisan communists. All right, so here's an example of this jumbled ethnic foundation. It is just, I keep using the word tidy. This is so untidy. The Ustasi tried to deport Serbs to Serbia, which was occupied by the Nazis. The Nazis in Serbia only agreed if Croatia would accept Slovenes in exchange. Those Serbs the Ustasi did not deport were forcibly converted from their Orthodox faith to the Catholic faith. And I mentioned earlier, but this forced conversion and torture and massacre saw even clergy participating. Catholic clergy were known to have participated in killings. So this attempt to homogenize an area sounds like crimes against humanity, war crimes, but also that ethnic cleansing, where we talked about this idea of homogenizing and cleansing. So that may be, though ethnic cleansing is not legally accepted, this seems like a real example of ethnic cleansing, which included in one of the definitions, not just ethnic, but religious. So it's Catholics versus Orthodox. Regarding the Ustasi and a priest, here's a quote. This is a quote from a Roman Catholic priest. In this country, nobody can live except Croatians. We know very well how to deal with those that oppose conversion, that is conversion to the Roman Catholic faith. The priest is saying, quote, I personally have put an end to whole provinces, killing everyone. Goes on to say, it gives me no remorse to kill a small child when he stands in the path of the Ustasi. A Roman Catholic priest. More quotes. This is just giving us an idea of the grotesque brutality of the Ustasi. A Croatian governor of Western Bosnia said that all undesirable elements will be exterminated so that no trace will remain. So there's that word exterminate again. And the quote goes on, the highways will be waiting for the Serbs to pass, but the Serbs will be no more there. I have published drastic orders for their total economic destruction, and other orders will follow for their complete annihilation. Do not be weak toward any one of them. Destroy them whenever you get a chance, and the blessing of our leaders and mine will be upon you. It's coming from a governor of Western Bosnia saying that, using words like exterminate and annihilate, complete annihilation. Maybe to bring this home about the Ustasi and their viciousness, one more quote, and this specifically touches on Pavlich and is reminiscent of something we've already talked about. So regarding Pavlich, saying, the Croatian people wish to be ruled with goodness and justice, and I am here to provide them. Now, this is during a visit. An Italian author was visiting Zagreb and was meeting with Pavlich. So Pavlich is saying the people want to be ruled with goodness and justice while they're out murdering all these people, but he's saying he's there to provide them. So while Pavlich spoke, the author noticed a wicker basket on Pavlich's desk with the lid slightly raised. It looked like it was full of mussels or shelled oysters. The author asked if they were Dalmatian oysters, again, oysters from that coastline. According to the author, quote, Pavlich removed the lid from the basket and revealed the mussels, that slimy and jelly-like mass. And he said, smiling with that good-natured smile of his, this is now Pavlich, it is a present from my loyal Ustashis, 40 pounds of human eyes. In Cambodia, it was severed heads. In the Armenian Genocide, it was severed heads. And we'll see more of that idea. And so this is a new kind of concept to add to this disgusting trends that we see, and that is this idea of bizarre trophies, and that certainly qualifies as bizarre trophies. If we remember, if you took session 2, the Cambodian genocide, we had the General Lon Nol, whose troops, to prove their loyalty to him, sent heads to him. So when you use the words like Pavlich was using, the priest was using, of extermination and annihilation, we're looking at genocide, absolutely, and the other 3 mass human rights violations as well. So they weren't ashamed of what they were doing, and they were renowned for their viciousness, and we saw some examples of that. So what responsibility do the Ustasi bear regarding murdered Serbs? Well, this will give you an idea of why I keep saying the numbers are so difficult. Per a Nazi, Hermann Neubacher, 750,000. He says that the Ustasi killed 750,000. According to Tito, partisan, communist, absolutely opposition of the Ustasi, Tito credits them with 500,000 in just 3 months of 1941. According to the Chetniks, it was somewhere between 600 and 800,000. According to the Serbs themselves, it was that same number as Neubacher, that's 750,000. In the end, between 1941 and 1945, those numbers work out to around 650,000 or so. Of the people that the Ustasi are said to have murdered, 28,000 were Jews. An additional 28,000 were Gypsies, Roma and Sinti. Since the Ustasi were affiliated with the Axis, the Jews and the Gypsies are considered part of the Holocaust. And as we said earlier on, half of the number of the Serbs that they killed also, according to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, half of the Serb civilians who were killed were part of the Holocaust as well. Lastly, how about Germany and Italy, the occupation armies, but not just the German occupation army, but also the SS who was there, and the Hungarians and the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the others. What was their responsibility? So in order to look at Germany and the Axis role, we're going to do more of a timeline, and I'm going to, I think, hit quicker. I will attempt to do some quicker points along the way. All right, so in October 1940, the Italians invaded Greece from Albania. They never told Germany they were doing this, and that actually kicked off the Balkans campaign. Hitler offered assistance because the Italian military slowed down almost immediately. In fact, in November of 1940, the Axis suffered its first land battle defeat. Who was it? It was the Greeks entering Albania and defeating the Italians. In December 1940, Hitler issues Führer Directive number 20 for an operation called Operation Marita, and that was for the invasion of Greece. In January 41, Mussolini visits Adolf Hitler in Berchtesgaden and accepts an offer of help in North Africa, which they desperately needed, but not in Albania. Mussolini wanted to win Albania without Germany's help. Now to April 6, 1941, this is when German, Hungarian, and Italian forces invaded Yugoslavia. And they came in from Austria and from Romania and from Bulgaria and from Albania. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, bombed Belgrade from 7 to 8:30 a.m. It was a Sunday, and that resulted in the death of at least 4,000, or I should say approximately 4,000 civilians. That sounds like war crimes, to knowingly bomb that city, knowing that civilians were out doing early morning Sunday chores or heading to church. In April of 1941, still, Germans captured Zagreb. Ante Pavlich then returned he had been in exile, and so then he became the leader. Here's an idea from the Balkans campaign in Greece. It's not part of this Yugoslavia thing. It's a tangent, but it's illustrative. In Crete, Greece, German Luftwaffe General Kurt Student issued an order authorizing reprisals against the civilian population. That included women and boys and children, girls, proven of involvement in fighting, committing sabotage, mutilating or killing wounded soldiers, which I talked about earlier. The reprisals per Student were to consist of shooting, of fines, of firebombing or burning villages, or the extermination of the total male population of a village. To their credit, several senior German officers stormed out of the conference that was being held where General Student announced this order to protest it. However, and unfortunately, there were others to fill the void, and they were prepared to lead execution squads. So essentially, the Einsatzgruppen in Yugoslavia and Greece. Well, the Balkan campaign ended June 1st, 1941. German military occupation was made difficult by competing interests, the military, the SS, the Waffen-SS, and police agencies, because the SS and the Waffen-SS were a separate entity altogether. Communication between the two was difficult, and also how to persecute the war was looked at very differently between a regular German Wehrmacht soldier and a Waffen-SS, let alone a non-Waffen-SS or a person affiliated with the police. So what was the Axis approach that ends up leading to these genocide and mass human rights violations? Well, the policy of the Germans was stern, but it was consistent compared to that of the Italians, which was inconsistent and just sometimes stern, sometimes lax. Serbia presented the Germans with a special problem, and that was traditional Serb hostility to everything Germanic. How did the Bulgarians behave? As part of the Axis, they put troops from the south and the east in Thrace and Macedonia. And of course, there were historic animosities between those groups as well. So the treatment by the Bulgarians from the start was arbitrary, and it was severe during their occupation. The Bulgarians in Yugoslavia faced a similar pacification problem that the Germans did. And they actually ended up taking the Bulgarians actually executed anti-guerrilla operations on their own without informing the Germans. In general, the Bulgarians and those anti-guerrilla operations were so brutal, so savage, designed to quell any resistance, that the Germans wanted to know about the operations in advance. It was actually too brutal for German leadership on the ground in Yugoslavia. Retaliation for attacks on Bulgarian forces was even swifter than we saw with the Germans. So here's an example. In March of 1943, 32 Bulgarians were killed. 26 were wounded. This is an attack south of a town, Skopje. The reprisal for that was Bulgarian troops shot near 300 people in the vicinity. They burned 550 houses, and they put 715 people under arrest. The readiness of the Bulgarians to just shoot suspects without any investigation of any kind finally prompted the German commander in Serbia to request a careful preliminary examination of each case before an execution was carried out. The Hungarians occupied several small areas of Yugoslavia. I pointed that out earlier with the map that showed the territory that was most likely disputed. The most southern part of Hungary bordered with Serbia, Croatia, and I believe Slovenia. The Hungarians occupied several small areas of Yugoslavia in that territory and immediately incorporated them. Those territories were largely inhabited by Hungarian nationals. So because of that, the Hungarians were then more lenient toward that population. Force was formed in 1941 within Serbia. was not responsible to the Nedic government. This is an interesting group that was formed in Serbia in 1941. The Russian Guard Corps, 4,000 men, a Russian Guard Corps that was incorporated into the Wehrmacht, the German military, to show this lack of tidiness. That's the last thing you might expect in the German military would be Muslim soldiers, Muslim units, as we saw with the Ustassi, and then here we have Soviet or Russians in the German military. Now, true, most of them were anti-Soviet emigres, and in fact, they'd served in the military previously with the Tsar. So that also tells you their age, that they were older soldiers. Number of small-scale operations in Serbia and within the German zone of interest in Croatia were successful by those soldiers, but accomplished little in effectively curbing the guerrilla movement. That included the shooting of hostages, burning of homes of suspects, and whole communities, in fact, who were suspected of sheltering guerrillas. So this idea of attacking towns, villages that were headquartering the enemy is right out of the Cambodian, the Khmer Rouge that we saw in session 2. Between January and August of 1943, the German situation really started to show that it was weakening. There was a lack of sheer numbers, and there was a lack of loyalty from their allies. The population of the areas that were held by the Germans, held by their admittedly weakening Italian allies, by the Bulgarians, and by Pavlich's Croatian government, now totaled pushing 25 million people. In Yugoslavia, there were probably between 50 and 60,000 partisans, 12 to 15,000 Chetniks. In Albania, as many as 20,000, with the strongest group, that of the communist leader Enver Hoxha, Hoxha. Actions by occupation troops, particularly the Croats, the Ustassi, had alienated large segments of the population, which was the communists. In fact, many former collaborationists were forgiven and were accepted into guerrilla bands. Their ranks further swelled by Italian and Bulgarian deserters. So this is mayhem. By the late summer, early fall of 1943, who is loyal to who? Who is working with who? Italy's resolve was obviously putting the onus more on the Germans, who became spread thin, and that didn't go unnoticed by the partisans and other groups as well. The Italians ended up signing an armistice in September 3rd, 1943, and realigned themselves no longer with the Axis, but now with the Allies. However, there were still forces, Italian forces, in Albania, Slovenia, that Dalmatian coastline, in Montenegro, the Ionian coast, in different islands of Greece, some islands in the Aegean. There were still troops in Croatia, in interior Greece, and there were even troops under German command on Crete. So negotiations between the Allies and the Badoglio government were conducted in great secrecy. Thus, this Italian capitulation caught the Italian military by surprise, and the German commanders as well. So the immediate German reaction was Operation Constantine, which was the seizing control of the Italian-occupied areas that I just mentioned, and also to disarm any Italian units that refused to continue to persecute the war on the German side. So I said that this weakening of the Germans being spread thin, the indecisiveness and weakening of Italy before they signed the armistice did not go unnoticed. The partisan communists noticed, the Chetniks noticed as well. So all sorts of different groups noticed this and took advantage of it. This was a great opportunity for them to procure weapons and other bits of equipment. And this ended up leading to kind of a scrambling competition or race between the German military and these various guerrilla partisan groups to acquire that information. So the Germans needed to get to the Italians to disarm them before the guerrilla forces did. There were 4,000 men of the Isonzo, Bergamo, and Zara divisions, the Italian military in Dalmatia, Slovenia, and Croatia. They deserted their units. They deserted their Italian units and joined either the partisan communists or the Chetniks. So when that armistice was announced, 4,000 Italian soldiers deserted, some going to the partisan communists and some to the Chetniks. The Firenze division went over as an entire unit to guerrillas who were located in Albania. So the Germans were incensed by what they considered was treachery. And so they singled out Italian units and Italian installations along the way. Italian troops were disarmed by irregulars, the Chetniks. They were bombed. They were strafed in their where they remained by German airmen. German ground troops hunted them down, all of which is examples of war crimes. You can understand the Germans' dismay and sense of losing an ally, but what they were doing was persecuting war crimes. I mentioned Dalmatian, the Dalmatian Coast. There's an area called Split, and it had enormous stocks of food, clothing, fuel, ammunition, and those were all intended for the Italian occupation forces. That fell to the partisans, the partisan communists, and they had adherents there, the dock workers and other communists, pro-communists or people with communist sympathies in that area. So that was a boon. Partisans were then forced, of course, to evacuate Split, but they took quite a bit of material with them before the German forces arrived. The partisan communists weren't the only ones, though. I mentioned the Chetniks. The Chetniks also took advantage of this and moved into different parts of Dalmatia, and they seized long stretches of the coast area. They took stocks of arms that were intended for Italian units. Okay, so in 1943, there was this partisan operation where partisans allegedly killed 26 captured officers and enlisted men. The reprisal for that resulted in 220 prisoners being executed by the German military. Those examples are war crimes. In 1944, more desertions occurred, and that started to include now the Ustassi, the National Army of Croatia, the Serbian State Guard and volunteer corps, not to mention Yugoslavian, Greek, Albanian security auxiliary units. They were starting to desert in growing numbers, and many of them were going to the partisan communists. Some were going to a group, the ELAS, that's in Greece. Some were going to the Chetniks. Some were going to another Greek group, the EDES. But most were going to the communists, the communist partisans. That Russian Guard Corps, as well as Russian German formations like the 1st Cossack Division, did remain loyal to the Germans. However, excesses of the Cossack Division against the civilian population actually was a disadvantage for the Germans, as this Cossack division, kind of like the image of the Cossacks that we have in our mind, they left a trail of burned villages and terror-struck peasants in its wake, which is war crimes, which is more management for the Germans. Thousands of Italians, after a few months in German internment camps, decided to join labor units or auxiliary units to support the Germans. Army Group E requested and received permission to raise and equip a battalion of Greek security troops. The practice of replacing German units with foreign troops had its disadvantages. Certainly, we've seen that loyalty is a major issue. So, for example, it had become necessary for a General Loehr, L-O-E-H-R, to warn all Russian members of the Eastern battalions against desertion. The German war situation was worsening. They knew that. And it had prompted Stalin to call on all Soviet citizens in the German service to abandon that, to obstruct operations in any way they could. And a number of them started to do so. They deserted, they spread rumors, they incited other troops against the Germans, German officers and non-commissioned officers. Belgrade fell to the Russians, and the 1st Partisan Corps, October 20, 1944. In the south, German forces approached the Greek-Yugoslav frontier, leaving Greece in the hands of the ELAS, the EDES, and the Brits. Others made their way to the northwest to evacuate the last of their forces from Macedonia, Albania, and Montenegro. Thousands of Chetniks, Serb auxiliaries, Croatian soldiers, and individuals who had assisted the occupation forces in one way or another joined the columns of withdrawing German troops. The result of that withdrawal, Tito became the de facto chief of state. He was able to then focus his energy to crush the Chetnik opponents. In Albania, so this is a giant vacuum that's been opened up. In Albania, a civil war ensued until Enver Hoxha and his communist faction took control of Albania. So military operations were shifting to the north and to the west. The hinterlands of Albania and Yugoslavia and a large part of Greece became the scene of now more savage fighting as a strong push for communism made its ruthless bid for power. For example, an air reconnaissance reported that the 1st Mountain Division, a German group, the 1st Mountain Division, was encircled, and they were heavily engaged in close quarters fighting. So it attempted a breakthrough. It was in this engagement that a battalion aid station had moved too far forward, and it was overrun by guerrillas. 80 wounded were murdered and mutilated. Another example of war crimes. So the German occupiers, as part of their genocide, the Holocaust, the genocide of Jews and Gypsies there, also killed resistors, intellectuals, communists, those who attacked German soldiers, etc. The numbers are staggering for them as well, as we'll see in the with the tracker. Right, to summarize what we've talked about in this really high overview, we look at hostilities that were series of major struggles within the framework of a war and genocide, that is World War II and the Holocaust, and within that context in Yugoslavia, series of, if not civil wars, certainly powers vying for control once the occupation forces were gotten rid of. A large number of the casualties inflicted by the Chetniks, the partisan communists, and the Ustasi, not to mention the German and Italian occupation and all of the Axis, but those 3 main Yugoslavian groups. A large number of the casualties were suffered in the intermittent conflicts and in the Civil War and after the withdrawal of the German occupation force. This is where the Chetniks and the Partisans fought one another, and the Germans at the same time, and the Ustasi fought the Serbs and assisted the Germans as well. The Yugoslav casualties were further compounded by that Croatian-Serbian strife, by a massacre or massacres of Serbs by the Ustassi, which occurred shortly after the establishment of the Croatian state, the independent state of Croatia. Again, we mentioned Albania, and the struggle between nationalist and communist factions was just as bitter as the fight of both the communists and the nationalists against the occupying forces. In this case, in Albania's case, the Italians. The Germans obviously added fuel to this fire by enlisting Muslims in their forces, Soviets or Russians in their forces, and using them as occupation forces, especially the former. And I suppose the most significant results of that occupation were in the political realm. 2 kingdoms fell, if we consider Albania as one of the kingdoms. Communism really was able to get a foothold in that territory of the Balkans down into Greece. The Italians undertook no really appreciable measures during their occupation to prevent the growth of a guerrilla movement. They did attempt suppression, and it would be harsh, and it would be arbitrary, and it was inconsistent, and it would end up kindling resentment. Yugoslavia in order to appease Italian, Bulgarian, and Hungarian ambitions, was partitioned and temporarily ceased to exist as a total sovereign state. Even worse, one large minority, that was the Croats, were granted independence and then accepted into the ranks of German satellites. Italian and Bulgarian reprisals for guerrilla activities, often inflicted on innocents, alienated more of a bulk of the population. And it's not surprising that the occupiers took advantage to secure a large forced labor force, which is war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so forth. All right. So this will be one of the links that is in the folder, the session 4 folder. And I don't often or generally don't use Wikipedia because of sourcing issues. I think you guys have come across that. However, this is a fascinating, revolting and fascinating page. First of all, it shows us over here a map of massacres, and it's broken down by who perpetrated the massacre. But more importantly for our purposes, it gives us a little summary of who the Ustasi were, who the Chetniks were, who the Partisans were, and a little bit about the Axis occupying forces. But here, if you look, right, so this gives us a really good idea of when it was taking place, how many people were killed, and who was the perpetrator. And so if you look at first, you see the Ustasi and the German forces. This is all early on, 1941. A lot of the Ustasi, including the Ustasi Muslim militia, which is fascinating, all took place early in 1941. Then you see Chetniks, Serbian rebels, Chetniks, Serbian rebels, and then it starts to change. It starts to change into that Chetniks and Serb rebels. And the numbers range, tiny numbers, 37, 500, 1,200 by the Ustasi. We see different forces that we haven't mentioned yet, but different guerrilla forces. We see that the Albanians were involved, German soldiers were involved, the Chetniks were involved. Who did they murder? Muslim peasants. We see the Ustasi involved. Who did they murder? Serbians. We see the Hungarian army. Who did they murder? Serbs. We see the Partisans. Who did they murder? 41 prisoners. We see that the Italian forces are alleged to have committed, as we said, war crimes, crimes against humanity, Slovenian hostages. So the Italian forces were involved in this. We mentioned the Chetniks and the Italians actually teaming up. So as we move through 1942 and 1943, we see that it transitions away from the Ustasi to the Chetniks and to the Italian forces. This is the Italian forces leading right up to when they are going to sign an armistice and become part of the Allies versus the Axis. German forces again in 1943 picking up the slack for the Italians. Then we start to see the Partisans, 270 civilians, reprisals against Italians and anti-communists. The German forces again, and these are the numbers that are killed. So here, the Partisans killed between 5,000 and 11,000. So a lot of these are small, and then we'll get to some more significant ones as we move along into 1945 and late 44 and 45. So here we have the Partisans between May of 44 and 1945, 55,000 people. And this is that anti-communist, hunting anti-communists. 58,000 killed by partisans, partisan communists. 51 people killed by the Partisans. So this goes on and on. And so as the Ustasi were heavily involved early on, the Partisans were involved heavily at the end of the war and then post-World War II. This list does not go too far post-World War II up to 1948, but these numbers, 58,000, 1,500, 12,000, 15,000, 10 to 12,000, those are significant numbers. And the people in each of these cases who are being killed, this has nothing to do with military. This has nothing to do with soldiers during a war footing. This is people who are considered civilians. And remember, if a soldier has surrendered or is wounded and cannot fight, he or she is not considered an enemy combatant at that point. He or she is to be treated well. And certainly these massacres and executions of prisoners and so forth is not what we're looking at. By the way, I mentioned Bloody Christmas, and here's a link to Bloody Christmas from this webpage, this website of Wikipedia, and the list of mass executions and massacres in Yugoslavia during World War II. So good map, certainly a good long list anyway. Leading up to one of the last ones here, there's also a link to a YouTube video that's very good, and it overviews part one of Yugoslavia's history. Now it runs about 55 minutes. The first 40 or so are in English, and then it looks like it transitions from English to another language that I couldn't understand. So about a good solid 40 minutes are very, very good. There are some subtitles, but then they sort of overlap as well, and it becomes a little bit confusing. So, but I'll have a list of links, including this to the Wikipedia page for Bloody Christmas as well, and so that should give you at least a jumping off point. So here is the tracker, and this is the way I've broken it down. The Chetnik partisans, the German occupiers, the Italian occupiers, the Ustasi terrorists, the communist partisans, and I added a couple other lines here. This is a very, as I said at the beginning, I'll say it again, this is a very confusing series of events. So British betrayal, the question mark, and then others, other Axis members, Hungarians, Bulgarians, and so forth. Next column is the date. Now this is the date of either their leadership or their involvement. In the case of Mexico, it was much easier because these were periods when a particular president, dictator, or whatever was in charge. Same thing with Cambodia, but here with Yugoslavia, these are dates of involvement. So we see that the communist partisans, we're saying 1941 to 1980, that's with Tito's death, but these other groups ended in 1945, although the Italians actually ended in 1943. Their system of governance, whether or not it was relevant, the Chetniks were anti-communist, they were loyalists, they were nationalists, they were monarchists. The German occupiers were fascist, nationalists, as were the Italians, as were the Ustasi. And of course, the communist partisans were communists. The British, although this doesn't play a role, they are a constitutional monarchy. And then the Hungarians, Bulgarians, etc., are various different systems of governance. The reason we're tracking these different systems of governance, again, is so we can put it on today's left-right paradigm and see. Again, as I stated in, I think, sessions 1, 2, and 3, I'll say it here in 4, it's not a gotcha to say, aha, it's this side that has a propensity for genocide and mass human rights violations, or it's that side that does. Because as we're seeing, if you look in Cambodia, you have nationalists and anti-communists, but you have communists as well, both of which were involved in genocidal or mass human rights violations behaviors. I put them on today's left-right paradigm. The first group, the Chetniks, I said moderate to right-wing. I'm not going to fight someone over this, but if we looked at them in today's left-right paradigm, I would say maybe moderate, maybe right-leaning. The German occupiers, the Italian occupiers, and the Ustasi terrorists, we're going to say are right, and I've got an asterisk for that, which we'll mention in a second. The communist partisans, I think everyone would accept that they're considered, at least in today's paradigm, the left. The Brits will just say moderate or not applicable, and same for the others, the Hungarians, Bulgarians, etc., because of their varying different systems of governance. I put the asterisk here for fascism because fascism is stereotypically attributed to the right. There are people who argue that fascism is actually not a right ideology, but is actually a left ideology. There's a lot of discussion there. We could have a lot of discussion on that. It would be an interesting topic to look at. There's arguments certainly on both sides. We're going stereotypically, it's attributed to the right. So this is no offense when we put the fascist nationalists as right wing. I understand, so understand that Mussolini was a socialist, an ardent socialist, son of a socialist, and he looked at his form of socialism as national, right? The Italian nation, not the world. So national socialism, which we associate with the Nazis, but it was socialism. So were the Nazis socialist? Well, that's debatable as well. If you look at the 1921 and I think 1925 party platforms, it's interesting. It's basically broken into three sections. One section deals with Jews, gypsies, and is absolutely racist in that sense. One deals with administrative issues, and one is more social and economic. The social and economic, which I think is points 11 through 17 or somewhere like that, you'll see it if you look up the party platform, are absolutely ideas that we would attribute to today's left. Did Hitler and the Nazis actually mean it? Is the counter to that argument. Okay, so there's a lot to this. That's why I put the asterisk here, but I think we can go with at least the stereotype that the communists are the left and the nationalists are the right. So that's where they are on this tracker, this paradigm tracker. So now, the names of the countries that were used, we tracked, for example, in Cambodia, it was the Khmer Republic, then it became Democratic Kampuchea, and then Cambodia. So the leaders often changed the names. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia became those 9 separate regional entities that we saw. It included among them the independent state of Croatia, and under Tito, Yugoslavia as a whole became the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. Another thing that we looked at was the concept of totalitarianism, and that we said this, I think, in the first session, is that totalitarianism is, I think, more poignant than where these people fit on the left, right, or where these governments fit on today's left-right paradigm. Totalitarians can be left, can be right, and I suppose they could be moderate as well, although that sort of defies logic in a way, but they certainly can be extreme left and extreme right. Totalitarianism is the thing that is, I think, to fear. It's to fear historically, it's to fear in the future as well, more so maybe than the left and the right. So we put them on a totalitarian tracking column to determine if they were totalitarian. And Mihailovich, the person we associate with the Chetniks, was he totalitarian, or was the Chetnik approach totalitarian? And I would say no. Was Hitler totalitarian? Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. Absolutely was. Mussolini was a totalitarian. Mussolini was a totalitarian. Was Pavlich totalitarian? Yes. Was Tito totalitarian? Yes. And then again, for the British and the Hungarian and the others, it's really not applicable. All right, and so now these numbers that we've talked about, attributed to the Chetniks, approximately 100,000 this is non-war deaths, 100,000. For Hitler and the Nazis, the Germans, 625,000. Mussolini and the Italians, 5,000. And we saw when we looked at the Wikipedia list, it's way more than that, but that's a number that's attributed to them. To Pavlich and the Ustasi, 650,000. For Tito and the partisan communists, 100,000, and possibly attributed to the Brits, as many as that as well. So the main guys are the Chetniks, 100,000, the Ustasi, 625,000, the Germans, 625,000. Okay, so regarding the numbers, Mihailovich, Chetniks, 100,000. Hitler, the Germans, 625,000. The Italians, Mussolini, 5,000. The Ustasi, 625, 650,000, that's Pavlich. Tito and the partisan communists, 100,000. That is, for Tito and the partisan communists, that 100,000 number is way too low, I believe, and it is from 1941 to 1944, mid-44. The number that I come up with for a total is more like 1.5 or 1.6 million. Again, we said at the beginning that it's approximately 1 million deaths. One of the issues is, again, that the U.S. Holocaust Museum attributes 325,000 of the approximately 325,000 of those deaths that are attributed to both the Nazis and, as part of the Holocaust, and the Ustasi as well. So between 1 million and 1.6 million people. Incidentally, Tito's government from 1944, 1945 through 1980 is assumed to have killed approximately 1 million more people. Obviously, that isn't attributable to the Holocaust and doesn't even really fit in with this, but it does follow Tito's career from the end of World War II through the end of his life in 1980, an additional 1 million people. Was genocide being perpetrated? So was genocide being perpetrated by the Chetniks? No. By Hitler? Obviously. Yes, indeed. By the Italians? No. By the Ustasi? Yes, and I put partially. So partially due to their alliance with the Germans, the people that they killed, and the intent behind the killing, the deportation of Jews, the murder of gypsies, even their participation in killing some of the Serbian civilians who were killed, partially. But some of the Serbian, especially the Serbian civilians who were killed, is more than likely goes back to a longer standing feud between Croats and Serbs. So I put partially on that. 100,000 for Tito, was that genocide? No, it was political. It's absolutely political. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing was basically committed by all of them. The Chetniks, Hitler, Italy, Croats and Ustasha, the partisan communists, by Britain, they committed crimes against humanity, by the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, Albanians, etc. Same for war crimes. The only area that is always questionable is ethnic cleansing, again, because it's not legally defined, legally accepted by the United Nations. But if we go with the definitions that we looked at earlier, I would say it's possible that we could attribute the idea of ethnic cleansing based on religion to Mihailovich and the Chetniks, to Hitler and the Nazis, absolutely. I don't know if the Italians could be considered ethnic cleansing, and I tend to lean towards no. The Ustasi, absolutely. And the communist partisans, yes, absolutely. They were trying to clean people out based partially anyway on their ethnicity. All right, so I said at the beginning that this topic of Yugoslavia was bewildering. I think I used the term an array of foreign sounding names and so forth. And I think with this very high level look at it, we can see why. Next, in session 5, which will follow, which will be accessible as of November 1st, 2020, will be kind of the follow-up to this. So we'll be looking at these same territories: Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, areas in the former Yugoslavia that we see with direct connections, with lifelines back to World War II, and we'll see issues that arise in the 1990s and into the 2000s. So that'll be session 5. This session 4, everything should be located in the folder. If you have questions, email me. My email is sam@hmcec.org. That's sam@hmcec.org. In the session 4 folder, in addition to the links and the activities and this, obviously this YouTube link, I put a template for a survey. It's a PDF document, so if you can copy, paste it into an email and just plug in your name, the date you attended, the session you attended, Yugoslavia, and any comments you have of things that could be better or different, or if you have questions, let me know. I'd really appreciate it. Again, I would like to credit the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, the Merrill Color Educator Series, for their ongoing assistance for these teachers' workshops to take place. I know it's unusual to be doing this remotely, but that is the state of things today. So we're going with all remote. And again, this will be for the year. Good news is it will be accessible anytime for any teachers that need it. Public, private, homeschool, alternative, religious school, anyone. And of course, the general public as well is more than welcome to access these if they like to. Again, if you have questions, please let me know. My name is Sam Parrish. This is from Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center Teachers Workshop Series on Genocide. And until next time, thank you.